All who has come against me shall fall by the wayside. Ashe, God up and God rising.
The study of history is as much the study of etymology as it is the study of interpretation of actual events. Both are often a daunting task. Ultimately, history is always written by the victors, and the meaning of language and the significance of historical events are invariably decided by those whose hands have taken a firm hold of the tiller that steers society's ship. The word fairy, as we have come to understand from our educators, or shall I say deceivers, suggests one of a variety of mythic or imaginary beings whose shape, size, habitat, and customs differ according to geography and ethnic or aboriginal folk tradition. Lately, a fairy has also come to mean a homosexual. A real fairy would not care at all about anyone's sexual orientation and would just think it's all bread and bread after all. The latter definition would be no doubt dismissed entirely, and she and he would nevertheless take extreme exception to the former definition for the following reasons. Apart from the Jews, no race in history has suffered more brutality and racial prejudice than the elves. For over 1,000 years, the church initiated a consistent policy of genocide that was and still is unrivaled in human history in terms of its relentlessness, violence, and hatred. The word genocide is used with justification. In 1944, Raphael Lemkin formulated the term to define an attempt at the destruction of the national group as an entity, and the actions involved are directed at individuals, not in their individual capacity, but as members of a national group. The United Nations elaborates by saying that genocide includes the systematic moral debasement of a group, people, or nation. The Jews have suffered just this, except in one particular respect. If you are asked your race or nationality today and you reply Jewish, no one would think twice about it. Imagine, however, asking Mr. Green or Miss Lebowitz what race they were and they replied Jewish. What would be the reaction if you then burst into fits of laughter and replied, "Don't be stupid. Jews don't exist. They're just a myth." Isn't that what genocide or ethnic cleansing is all about? Eradicating all trace of a culture from the human consciousness. This is what has happened to the fairy race. Certainly, the Germans tried it with the Jews. And if they had been given the same amount of time the church has had to achieve what they have achieved, no doubt in 1,000 years from now the Jews would have also become a myth. But this has already happened to the fairies. Little trace of their culture or identity exists outside. A handful of the old families or beyond the covers of sanitized storybooks for children, or tombs on rustic folk tradition in which hunts of the old lord still remain hidden. Mr. Green and Miss LeBeaut can go about their business in relative freedom and can be openly proud of their nationality and cultural heritage. For 1,000 years, the fairies have had to conceal their identities and live in hiding for fear of being torn to shreds or burnt alive. For 1,000 years, it has been a crime to be of the elven race. You may be surprised to learn that it still is. Today, whilst the Jews, by the grace of God, enjoy the acceptance of their race, one, through the backlash of public opinion against the Nazi Holocaust, the 1,000-year elven Holocaust has been forgotten. Still, the fairies have to remain in hiding, contemporarily for fear of ridicule and ostracism. In 1736, the Witchcraft Act was repealed. However, it was replaced by the Fraudulent Mediums Act, which is still in force and simply says in one way what the Witchcraft Act said in another. According to Christian doctrine, no one can contact departed spirits. If this is admitted, then inevitably all mediums are fraudulent, because the English language defines a medium as being a person who has commerce with the souls of the dead. By dragon definition, a witch, meaning a fairy, is a medium, and the law wouldn't lay a fine distinction upon exactly what the witch mediates with or how. If they decided they wanted to win an argument, it would be noticed at this juncture that by definition, in their prayers to and visions of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the departed saints, all those who currently call themselves Christians are in fact indulging in mediumship. This is why the very act in which the church says is impossible, and by which edict they rendered their entire following heretical. This has always been the case. And during the witch craze, all things considered, it was actually the heretics who were burning the Orthodox Christians. If the witch mediates with ancestors, she claims to be able to contact the dead. As the church says this is impossible, the witch is a fraud and is breaking the law, ergo to be, or claim to be, a witch, and consequently a fairy. On that count alone is illegal. The witchcraft laws are alive and well and living in a statute book near you. Further, by implication, it is possible for a fairy to be tried under the Treason Act as well, on 2 counts. Firstly, Her Majesty the Queen is a Christian and the head of the Church of England. No fairy aware of his or her history and the atrocities committed against their people could ever be what is contemporarily thought of as an Orthodox Christian. In this sense, they run the risk of committing an act of treason by denying the Christian faith, because in doing so, like others following different paths, they refute and insult the faith of Her Majesty. Secondly, the fairy family stood in absolute opposition to the donation of Constantine, this being the document that was used to usurp them and initiate the Elven Holocaust itself in the first place. The donation of Constantine. The donation of Constantine first appeared during the 8th century and was a document which purported to recognize the Roman popes as Christ's representatives on earth, and to denote to Pope Sylvester and the Roman Church all those imperial powers formerly invested in the throne of Byzantium. The donation, the church claimed, was written in the 4th century at the insistence of the Emperor Constantine. The church said that he was so grateful for having been cured of leprosy by Pope Sylvester that he gave into the church's hand the entire power and wealth of the unified Roman Empire, including the right to crown and dethrone kings. Now that is what you call expensive medical insurance. Supposedly written before 33-7 AD, the year of Constantine's death. The notion that Constantine actually didn't make an appearance on the stage of European history until 400 years later. So far-reaching are the powers bestowed upon the church by this document, one would have thought that it would have been made public at the time of its bestowal, not centuries later. The provisions of the donation were in force in 751 AD. The Merovingians were shortly thereafter deposed by the church and replaced by their sycophants, the mayors of the palace, who later became known as the Carolingians. The church had made compact with the mayors and offered to recognize their legitimacy as rulers if they would dispense with the true dragon kings. The deal was done, and the Carolingians were made the puppet rulers under the donation because it was made by a dragon king, Constantine, legitimized the church's right to take this action to all intents and purposes. They had the authority of dragon kingship given up to them by this charter. No doubt, the Merovingians knew this to be a fraud, which is why they refused to recognize the authority of the church to meddle in affairs of state. What do we learn from this? We can see from the church's choices of benefactor that the church was well aware that universally, only those of the dragon blood would be recognized as true kings. Therefore, they chose Constantine, as he was known to have been descended from both the Britannic Pendragon house and the Dragon House of David. Furthermore, he was a member of the Disposani, the hearers of the Lord, the blood descendants and legitimate representatives of Jesus Christ. In the donation, it appeared as if Constantine had relinquished his hereditary spiritual position as a Messiah and invested it in the papacy. By suggesting they were the representatives of Christ, the popes were claiming dragon descent for themselves. It was well known that Jesus had descendants and that they were part of the only Eurasian dynasty which was authorized to be kings, the elven overlords, or dragons. It would have appeared to the public then that in the displacement of the Merovingians, one dragon dynasty was being replaced by another. How about a paper one? This reduced any danger of mass unrest. As time passed, however, it became uncomfortably clear that the function of kingship under the Merovingians had been entirely different to that under the Carolingians. Whilst the Merovingians had formerly assumed the role of overseers, sages, and wise counselors, the Carolingians and their successors, prompted by the church, became deliberately poorly educated, ignorant, insensitive tyrants and territorial tradesmen. Dragon kingship in the Grail Code had died, to be replaced by a corrupted form of feudal totalitarianism and brutal economic slavery, as the church carefully and strategically replaced the old dynasties with its own merchant class client families who, from that day forth, became vassals of the Vatican. Lastly, we learned that from 751 AD, the true Dark Age began in earnest. The Elven Holocaust was initiated and run its course for another 1,000 years until, in England at least, the witchcraft laws were repealed in 1736. North of the border in Scotland, however, the persecution of witches in the 1700s was at its fiercest until the end of the century. During this time, history has witnessed the rise of the Church of Rome and its successful struggle for power. In time, no dynasty ruled in Europe or remained in power unless the church sanctioned their reign. The church chose the royal families, it crowned kings, and disposed its detractors. In short, the church, under the auspices of the donation of Constantine, was the sole and supreme temporal power in Europe and the known world. Without this purported imperial benefice, however, the church would have remained a marginalized Mediterranean cult, contesting for patronage, along with a host of other Gnostic Christian denominations. The royal dynasty, sponsored by the church and crowned by its divine right, instituted their courts and parliaments, passed laws, employed agents to act on their behalf. To all intents and purposes, it seemed as if the church had the absolute right of dragons and wielded power by the very sanction of Jesus Christ and God. No monarch reigning today had no government under the monarch or instituted in their name would enjoy their position if the church, empowered by the donation, had not given them permission to rule in the first place. With the donation of Constantine, European history today would be totally different, and none of the dynasties past or present would have had the right to have reigned, nor would they reign now, and none of their governments or agencies would have exercised power. One slight problem though, the donation of Constantine is a complete and utter fraud, and the church was never giving any temporal powers at all, let alone the right to found destinies, dynasties, crown kings, and institute governments. The whole document was a lie from the beginning to end and has been known to be a fake since Lorenzo Valla applied the methods of historical criticism to it during the Renaissance. How do we know Valla was correct? The New Testament references incorporated into the wording of the donation were taken from the Latin Vulgate version of the Bible. The Vulgate Bible was compiled by Saint Jerome, who was born more than 2 decades after Constantine was supposed to have signed the donation. The actual Vulgate Bible wording that appears in the donation didn't exist until Saint Jerome invented it, 50 years after the document had supposedly been dated and signed by the emperor. By this time, Constantine had been dead for decades and couldn't have signed the dragon's rights away anyway. The language of the donation is 8th century clerical or dog Latin, whilst the Latin used in the 4th century empire was late classical Roman. The imperial and papal ceremonials described in the donation didn't exist in Constantine's time, but were developed some centuries later.
Several documentary instances of the church's use of the donation to assert their authority in the medieval period still exist, including the letter of Pope Gregory IX entitled Si Memoriam Beneficorium, dated October 23, 1236, and addressed to the Emperor Frederick II. Pope Gregory writes that as the vicar of the Prince of Apostles, the Roman Pope governed the empire of priesthood and of souls in the whole world. So he should also reign over things and bodies throughout the whole world, and considering that, he should rule over earthly matters by the reins of justice, to whom, as it is known, God had committed on earth the charge over spiritual things. The Emperor Constantine humbled himself by his own vow and handed over the empire to the perpetual care of the Roman pontiff, with the imperial insignia and scepters, and the city and duchy of Rome. People in the medieval and Renaissance period, confronted with this document, did not generally criticize the donation on the grounds of its veracity. They just exclaimed aghast that they could not believe that Constantine would have been stupid enough to have given the Roman Church everything. From the donation, we understand that Constantine offered the Pope all the robes and crowns of office, but the Pope, being such a humble man, gave them back to the Emperor. This lets the church off the hook should some malcontent turn up and ask for sartorial evidence. If the reader peruse the donation for themselves, they will be appalled at the pretentious egotism, arrogance, and sheer material greed of the church. Authors of the document: the fraudulent imperial power of the Vatican to create kings by coronation derived from this faked 8th century donation of Constantine, was later adopted by the archbishops of the Church of England, with the complicity of the Tudors, who were Catholics themselves. When he split with Rome, Henry VIII still retained and later ratified and re-established in the Anglo-Catholic Church of England the fraudulent right of the church's clergy to create by coronation a succession of British monarchs. This was an illegal act. The donation of Constantine was proved to be a completely fake document. Therefore, no royal elven house that knew its origins and cared about social justice could possibly bring itself to recognize a Christian British monarchy or any of their church-sponsored, church crown predecessors, or any of their regnate or formerly regnate European cousin houses. Because the donation was a fraud, and no subsequent priest of any Catholic-derived denomination ever had the right to crown kings. Britain has no legally reigning monarch for 900 years. As a consequence of this, all the laws passed by the monarchs were in all illegal and worthless, and all the governmental agencies set up by or derived from these monarchs or their laws are also illegal and worthless up to the present day. When considering this, we might like to consider the fact that all the arrests ever made by the police in America, Britain, and Europe, etc. are acts of kidnapping and habeas corpus. Equally, any man who has taken up arms for the crown and killed for his country is unprotected by law and guilty therefore of murder. However, paradoxically, as the entire British American legal system is illegal, there are no laws, and so the crimes of habeas corpus and murder as we define them today simply do not exist. Subconsciously, people know that their politicians and monarchs have no legitimate authority to rule over them. They manifest this knowledge in an increasing disrespect for these optional, arbitrary, and illusory social conventions, which is yet another reason why social order is breaking down